The helpful poem. Call me unfinished or give me an order. I'll help. Snap the heads of the peonies. Let the sun break the table. Of course, the cliffs are the wrong color, darling, and your unrepentant eyes. When we first met, kite tails flashed and ants scurried off with their eggs held aloft. And during our vows, the seething window pained us, but not on purpose. Sometimes we couldn't cross that space, the lovely shoulders of our lies. Are you still full of bones or snow? What kind of river are you? Yeah. So when I read this, to me, I interpreted it as the narrator is the helpful poem who's in relationship with this poet and trying to kind of guide them along into being the poet that they're supposed to be or want to be. And that they're declaring that they'll give help. They have a history together when they first met. Maybe there was a poem about kite tails and ants and things like that. Perhaps that was a childlike poem they were writing. And then moving forward through it, there were places where the poem couldn't even go in relationship with the poet. The lovely shoulders of our lies, which is one of my favorite lines in this poem. And then in the end, I felt like this helpful poem was giving off writing prompts. Are you still full of bones or snow? What kind of river are you? Like, let's get to writing. Let's do it. So to me, that's kind of how I was maneuvering in this. And I will admit that my first reading through, I did not understand that. And I was a little suspicious of the poem because I'm not one for exclamation marks in poetry. And I don't know why. They just, also sometimes I feel that way about when we're asking questions in poems. I get a little uncomfortable with it. But I really felt like it worked here because, again, it was that the narrator being the poem was really trying to rally together this excitement for writing the poem. And I also just wanted to point out that the line breaks were really lovely. And the ones that I wanted to, our vows, the seething window. I love that line just on its own is lovely. And then that space, the lovely shoulders, and that then breaks into of our lies, are you still full? Like, I was just like, this is great. This is darker and more meaningful than I thought, even with the exclamation marks. So it was a joy to read.
I thought that just on the superficial level, I thought the same thing. Because if there's a, ask me the odds of a poem with 3 exclamation points in it being accepted, it's like probably not very good, to be honest, just on that level. But obviously there's a lot more going on here that's in the context of the poem. It feels more superficial than maybe you would think. But yeah, that's on its own. I guess it's a sign of how strong the rest of the poem is, and the language and the question of what is going on. I was interested to hear if you had a thought, Chris, because I read this one romantically, and usually you're the one who does that. So I didn't think it was a poet talking to another poet or something. I thought there was a romantic relationship happening, or actually not happening. I thought it was maybe coming out of a relationship.
Yeah, you called me out directly on my.
I don't know. Maybe
mode network.
I've gotten too used to your readings. But yeah, just the line. You can think it over, but the line you mentioned. Maybe even sometimes we shouldn't cross that space, the lovely shoulders of our lies. I think that's what I mean. The relationship is kind of like the barriers of a relationship, and then saying, okay, well, this isn't going to work.
Well, I didn't, well, first of all, I absolutely read it the way you thought I would. So I did the romantic reading first. I was getting some marriage imagery. Maybe the boundary was before we get married, after we get married. And that was, again, poem physics. I was picturing we were trying to have a nice wedding, but there was this awkward window that was shining light in a way that was going to kind of disrupt the order of the wedding. So you're right that my first run through was absolutely along those lines. Second line through, though, I've been on a Rumi kick, and Rumi's obsessed with windows and doors and door sills and kind of the bridge between two worlds. So that made the mother and daughter cleaning the same window across from each other particularly potent. That kind of leapt out at me just because my radar is scanning for that kind of thing. So when I got to the seething window pane dust, I was like, oh, is she being cute about window panes? If not, as a song lyric, it would work, but not on purpose. And then the exclamation point, I think, is worthwhile there. Sometimes we couldn't cross that space, the lovely shoulders of our lives. So if I'm bringing my Rumi side, you can actually reconcile. It could actually be romantic, but also spiritual at the same time. He was a Sufi mystic monk who would embrace the idea that there are many ways to kneel and kiss the ground through religious experiences. And one of those might be going out and having a late night date, a little picnic in the moonlight with some wine and a beautiful girl and some sex. Or it might be actually physically kneeling and kissing the ground. And that's the actual religious experience. Or it might be just letting guests into your house, let other people into that door, into that world. And that could be a perfectly valid religious experience. So since I was steeped with that, that's kind of how I was reconciling that. I don't think that was the intention of the poem to be a romantic setup, but it has that spiritual theme that I thought so many of the poems we talked about today has.
I mean, it says darling. You know, it uses that as a descriptor. It's sort of funny. I think maybe all four of us have a slightly different interpretation. So when I read this one, for me, this was the poem given some personification. So you're the writer and you're writing, and the actual one that's on a piece of paper is like, okay, what do we need? Okay, keep coming. I like it. It says, call me unfinished or give me an order, tell me to do something. It reminded me of one of my favorite quotes, which is no poem is ever truly finished, only abandoned. And that to me is this poem that's been sitting on the shelf. It's been sitting in your notebook forever. And this is the poem actually becoming personified, like becoming a person being like, okay, no, like, what is that great part? Of course, the cliffs are the wrong color. Like when we first met, like all of this imagery. And then that's also interesting because there's a very intimate, that line, the lovely shoulders of our lives. That's like between the writer and the poem. It's like, we know when you're lying, we know when you're being pretentious, and we know when you're trying to do a crafty thing, when you're just being a poet, right? Instead of completely yourself, and that's fine. But maybe not cross that. And then it's like, okay, are you still full of bones? Like, are you still a writer? Like, are you still awake? Are you still a person? Like write me, let's get this done. And that's sort of how I was interpreting as well. All of the urgency behind all of the exclamation points was the poem that was like, okay, snap the heads off the peonies, let the sun break on the table, like give the poem something to do, give the poem some action. So that was my interpretation of this, was the poem itself trying to be helpful to you as the writer.
I have to say, I failed in my description of how I interpreted the poem. I mean the exact same thing that you're saying, is that the poem, no, I totally agree with you. Like we are seeing it the same way. The poem has an essence and the poem is speaking. It's almost like an epistolary poem from the poem to the poet.
Right. It's like a helpful, because I thought you meant that these were like two poets talking together. Like this is a poet talking to another poet. Gotcha. I misunderstood you.
No,
gotcha.
Your description of it was so great. So I'm so glad you thought of it the same way.
Yeah. Well, and that also, it sort of makes sense how, I mean, as a writer and as a poet, it makes sense that all of the ideas are sort of chaotic and all over the place. That when you're trying to finish a poem, you don't know what's going to be the best image. You're trying a million different things. Half of them aren't going to work, or you're, sort of scatterbrained and you have an idea over here, an idea over here. One is about kites, one is about eggs, one is about ants, one is about cliffs. And the poem's like, okay, just focus, let's pull it in. Let's get me written, And I think that that's, yeah, just fascinating. And I mean, that goes the great title, The Helpful Poem. That's a great title.
I
So
like
well
that.
done, Nancy.
It's obvious now that that's the correct interpretation.
Right.
And I was also noticing my inner, like, I can tell when I'm depressed because my inner critic will look at my own writing and say, it's terrible, and I'm terrible, and everything else is terrible. And I'll go through and be very cynical in the way I read other poems. This is sort of an antidote to that. Like, no, well, don't be cynical. It's all right. Chop the heads off the peonies, let the sun break on the table. That's fine. Of course, the cliffs were the wrong color. It's not your fault. And as somebody who's got like 2/3 of a novel rotting in the corner, it's like, oh, this is in fact a helpful poem. And if you
Right.
personify that energy and say, the reason they call you darling is because they're being sweet to you, the kind of creative process is personified in this elder sibling. Oh, that's lovely.
And when we look at it through this lens and read the line, and your unrepentant eyes, I mean, the poem is kind of teasing them at the same time.
I almost wonder if that's, yeah, the unrepentant eyes and the darling, is that a reference to Kill Your Darlings?
Mm.
Could that be what that is? It's like, obviously it's wrong and you knew that and you don't want to get rid of it because you like it.
Yeah,
I hope-
that is interesting. Yeah, I think,
That's
you
a good
know,
point.
once we get to that place of like what the poem is doing to the, yeah, we can kind of have fun with it. Yeah. But yeah, even the last line, and I mean, the river, that could, you know, just even just on like the symbolic terms, you know, it's the kind of the journey. I kind of took it as like kind of a stand-in for like journey. So the journey could be the creative process on that level. It could be the life, you know, the person's life on that level too. So it's kind of, yeah, it's that question of like, what's happening here? What is this journey? But yeah, just in that line of thinking, you know, if I think most people would kind of describe the creative process as like as indirect, or you know, sometimes haphazard, sometimes accidental, unpredictable. So that's the kind of the connotation that last question had to me. It's kind of like, you know, you can't question it too much. You just kind of have to say, well, I'm going to try this and see where it goes.
Yeah. Well, and the nice thing about what kind of river are you? That's such a kinder question than what kind of writer are you? What kind of poet are you? What kind of person are you? That's a much kinder question, I feel like, because rivers are always moving, they're always changing, they're always in motion. A river is not going to be the same. I feel like I'm Pocahontas. River's not going to be the same, you know, you can't touch the same river twice, whatever it is, whatever that quote is. But it's almost like, okay, you're in motion, your brain is always moving, right? Like rivers always do. So like, you know, what kind of motion do we have here? What are we going to do with this? So yeah, I like that.
I wanted to take these last few lines and just use them as prompts for myself. You know, I was like, what kind of river am I? I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
That
Are you still full of bones? What does that mean? Yes, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, just like some of the other poems, yeah, we kind of get some ideas in there that, you know, you wouldn't get to just on your own. So those group readings are always fun to do.